In 1978, Chicago police found the remains of at least 27 bodies buried beneath John Wayne Gacy's house. To this day, Gacy is one of America's most notorious serial killers, killing 33 young men and boys. His sister Karen visited him fairly regularly before his arrest.
The gate of the prison wide opened, and John Wayne Gacy stood motionless, gazing up and down. It was an execution day, one he had known was coming for so many years. Today, after years of legal battles, long nights in a cold, lonely cell, and decades of defiance, his life would come to an end. It was May 10th, 1994. The end had arrived. He'd always believed that his actions, the lives he had taken, the horror he'd unleashed, were somehow forgotten in the chaos of the world. Yet, as the officers ushered him to the holding room, Gacy knew this would be the day he would meet his maker. The end had arrived, and there was no more running from the truth. But how did it all begin? How did a young boy from a troubled family transform into one of the most notorious serial killers in U.S. history? Gacy's story didn't start in a prison cell. It started decades ago, in a small home in Chicago. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, to John and Marion Gacy. His early years were marked by a difficult and dysfunctional family life. His father was an abusive, alcoholic man who often belittled Gacy and his siblings. Gacy's father would call him names like sissy, and mock him for being overweight and having a speech impediment. These experiences shaped Gacy's early perception of himself and left emotional scars that would fester throughout his life. Despite the adversity at home, Gacy did his best to maintain a facade of normalcy. He attended school and participated in extracurricular activities, although he struggled to make friends. His need for validation from others became more intense as he grew older, especially in relation to his father's harsh treatment. The isolation Gacy felt at home only worsened when his father forced him to endure cruel punishment. In later years, Gacy admitted that his relationship with his father left him with a deep desire for approval and love, which he would later seek through manipulative and violent actions. At 18, Gacy moved away from Chicago, eager to escape his father's domination. He found work as a chef and briefly attended business school in Las Vegas. It was during this time that he began to show his darker tendencies. Although he was an outwardly charming, ambitious young man, he began harboring violent and sadistic fantasies that would later spiral out of control. Gacy returned to Chicago and got married to Marlon Myers in 1966. He seemed like the picture of a successful, family-oriented man with a good job and 2 children. Yet, beneath the surface, his violent urges grew stronger. He often fantasized about dominating others, and the seeds of his monstrous acts were already being sown. As Gacy's life progressed, he became more involved in local politics and community events. He cultivated an image as a respectable businessman, even as his secret identity remained hidden. But something far darker simmered underneath, waiting for the right moment to surface. In 1968, Gacy's desire for power and control grew more intense. He began to target vulnerable young men, using his charm and promises of work or money to lure them into his grasp. His first victim, Timothy McCoy, was a 15-year-old boy whom Gacy had invited to his home under the pretense of offering him a job. Gacy brutally strangled McCoy and buried his body beneath the floorboards of his house. This was the moment Gacy crossed the line from fantasy to reality. Though he had been suppressing his violent desires for years, the act of killing a young man seemed to give Gacy a sense of power he had never experienced before. The rush of control was intoxicating, and it ignited a twisted need to repeat the act. Over the following years, Gacy continued his killing spree, targeting young men who were easy to manipulate. He preyed on runaways, young adults, and even teenagers, often convincing them to come to his house for what seemed like legitimate opportunities. But once they entered his home, they would never leave. His method was chillingly simple. He would overpower his victims, often while dressed as his alter ego, Pogo the Clown, a persona he adopted for children's parties and community events. Gacy's house became a house of horrors, filled with the bodies of his victims. The authorities had no idea of the terror lurking behind the doors of his home, as Gacy was able to maintain a normal, friendly facade. His charm made him seem harmless, even likable, while his twisted urges remained hidden from the world. Though Gacy's actions were growing more brazen, he continued to lead a double life, one that would allow him to mask his crimes for years. However, his time as a free man was running out. John Wayne Gacy's life became increasingly defined by his clown persona, Pogo the Clown, which he used to gain access to vulnerable children and young men. At parties, Gacy would entertain children with balloon animals, jokes, and laughter, while masking his true, horrific identity behind the makeup and costume. His ability to blend into society made him even more terrifying. By this time, Gacy was already killing young men and hiding their bodies beneath his floorboards. But his outward persona of Pogo was a source of confusion for those around him. How could a man who performed at children's parties, engaging in such innocent fun, also commit such gruesome acts of murder? His clown persona gave him the ability to deceive people into believing he was harmless, and he used this as a tool to lower the defenses of his victims. Many of them were so trusting, not knowing that behind the clown makeup lurked a violent, sadistic killer. He would prey on young men, often offering them work or a place to stay, only to overpower and kill them once they were alone in his house. Gacy's life as Pogo the Clown allowed him to create the perfect cover for his sickening desires. He was able to manipulate and control his victims, all while maintaining his public image as a jovial entertainer. His true identity remained hidden, allowing him to continue his killing spree undetected. It wasn't until 1978, when the disappearance of a young boy, Robert Pius, finally caught the attention of the police, that Gacy's dark secret was exposed. As the investigation into Robert's disappearance unfolded, the police discovered a trail of bodies leading directly to Gacy's home. They would soon learn that Pogo the Clown was just a mask for a killer who had murdered at least 33 young men. John Wayne Gacy's arrest on December 21, 1978, shocked the nation. For years, he had managed to conceal his murderous acts, but the disappearance of Robert Pius led to the unraveling of his dark secret. Police began to investigate Gacy's background and found unsettling evidence linking him to several missing persons. The authorities searched Gacy's home and discovered a gruesome scene. They uncovered the bodies of young men, some of whom had been buried under the floorboards, while others were found in the crawl spaces of the house. The scale of Gacy's crimes was horrifying, and it became clear that he had been living a double life. The investigation into Gacy's crimes revealed that he had been operating under the radar for years. He was a respected member of the community, a businessman, and even a political donor. No one had suspected him of being a serial killer. His public persona as a clown, a friendly and approachable man, made it almost impossible for people to believe he was capable of such violence. As the police delved deeper into Gacy's life, they uncovered a pattern of manipulation and cruelty. He preyed on vulnerable young men, often luring them into his home under false pretenses. Once inside, Gacy would overpower and kill them, hiding their bodies in various parts of the house or disposing of them in nearby rivers. The sheer number of his victims was staggering, and the police could not believe they had missed such a chilling series of crimes. John Wayne Gacy's trial began in 1980, and it quickly became a media sensation. The details of his gruesome crimes horrified the public, and the prosecution presented a chilling portrait of a man who had methodically planned and executed his murders. Gacy's defense team tried to argue that he was insane, claiming that he had been suffering from a mental illness at the time of the killings. However, the prosecution countered this argument, presenting a case that painted Gacy as a calculating, cold-blooded killer. Gacy was found guilty of 33 murders, and the jury sentenced him to death. The trial was filled with horrific testimonies from survivors, who described Gacy's twisted actions and the terror they endured. Gacy himself remained calm throughout the trial, denying his guilt and continuing to assert that he was innocent. Despite his claims of innocence, the evidence against him was irrefutable. The bodies of his victims, the photographs he had taken, and the testimonies of witnesses all pointed to his guilt. Gacy's trial lasted for several months, and in the end, he was sentenced to death for his crimes. Gacy's conviction shocked the nation, and his name became synonymous with evil. The media covered the trial extensively, and Gacy was thrust into the spotlight. The case raised questions about how such a seemingly ordinary man could commit such horrific acts. But for the victims and their families, the trial was a small step toward justice. John Wayne Gacy's time on death row was marked by a mix of defiance and acceptance. He continued to deny his guilt, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. Gacy's arrogance and refusal to show remorse became a focal point for the media. In prison, he became somewhat of a celebrity, with many fascinated by the fact that he had managed to hide his true identity for so long. While on death row, Gacy became known for his artwork. He began painting and drawing, creating portraits of famous people, including former U.S. presidents and clowns. Some of his artwork was sold to the public, although many were disturbed by the idea of purchasing pieces from a man who had killed so many. During his years in prison, Gacy's behavior was unpredictable. He would occasionally give interviews with the media, denying his crimes and continuing to insist that he was innocent. However, many of his statements seemed to be little more than attempts to maintain control over his image. Despite his claims of innocence, Gacy's legal options were running out. His appeals were rejected one after another, and his execution date was finally set. For Gacy, death was no longer a distant possibility, it was imminent. The question now was not if he would be executed, but when. On May 10, 1994, after 14 years on death row, John Wayne Gacy's fate was sealed. His execution was scheduled for that day, and there would be no more delays or appeals. His time on death row had come to an end, and his life would soon be over. In the days leading up to his execution, Gacy continued to deny his guilt. He made several attempts to appeal his sentence, but each was rejected. As the day drew closer, the reality of his impending death began to sink in. Gacy knew he would die that day, but he refused to accept responsibility for his actions. The final hours before his execution were marked by a sense of eerie calm. Gacy spent his last hours in a small, windowless cell. He was allowed to make a final statement, but his words offered no remorse. Instead, he chose to maintain his innocence, even in the face of his execution. His final words were chilling. "Kiss my ass." John Wayne Gacy's execution took place at the Stateville Correctional Center on May 10, 1994. His last meal request was a bucket of KFC chicken, a dozen fried shrimp, a pound of strawberries, and a Diet Coke. It was a meal that reflected the man he had become, a man who had lived a life of indulgence and violence. Gacy was led to the execution chamber and strapped to the gurney. He maintained his defiant attitude until the very end, refusing to acknowledge his guilt. As the lethal injection was administered, Gacy was calm and composed, offering no final words of regret or remorse. His defiance continued until the very moment he was put to death. When the needle was injected, Gacy's body became still. The man who had once been Pogo the Clown, the man who had preyed on so many vulnerable victims, was finally gone. His execution marked the end of a dark chapter in American criminal history. As the finality of John Wayne Gacy's execution echoed in the halls of history, one man's life came to an end. His reign of terror, his manipulations, and his twisted fantasies were silenced forever. But his legacy remains, an ever-present reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath even the most unassuming exterior. Gacy's crimes left a scar on the nation, haunting families and forever altering the course of criminal justice in America. Though the man known as Pogo the Clown is gone, the stories of his victims and the lessons learned from his case continue to resonate. It's a chilling reminder that evil can wear many faces, and even the most charismatic figures can be hiding horrors behind their smiles. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of the most chilling chapters of true crime history. If you found this story as compelling and haunting as we did, don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit the notification bell for more gripping true crime documentaries. Stay tuned for more disturbing tales from the darkest corners of criminal history. Until next time.